Mark Vientos absolutely raked yesterday while he was playing in the game. He went 3 for 3, by far the strongest Mets performance. Other than that, that game yesterday was not anything that I would say was something to brag about for the Mets. In fact, of all the games that I did live play-by-play coverage on, that was by far the least interesting, least fun game to watch. Hi, everybody. I'm Craig. This is MetropoliFins. We are YouTube's smallest New York Mets and Miami Dolphins channel, coming to you from a family-friendly and a rational fan's perspective. So I wanted to share a little bit of what we talked about on the stream last night of how do you look at preseason performance? Because some people are like, well, it's just preseason, nothing matters, and everybody is there's another group of people who are like, oh my goodness, this guy is struggling so much in preseason. This is horrible. This is going to be a bad season. I think you need to take a measured approach and you look at a couple things. First of all, you want to look at the history of the player. In other words, if it's a well-established star and they're struggling in spring training, I would not be going into panic mode. If, on the other hand, it's a newer, younger guy who's looking to break onto the team, then you might take things with a little more of a thing. So let me give you some examples here. Pete Alonso is Pete Alonso, right? And so I'm not going to be super concerned about his home run total, his batting average total, all those things in spring training, because he's going to be working out any and all kinks in his swing, fixing anything that's not supposed to be there, making sure his mechanics are good, and he's going to be probably trying and testing certain things. And so you have to remember that these vets are trying to perfect their craft. And so they might be willing to tweak with something that they normally do, try something a little bit different in a spring training game where it doesn't matter. Now, on the other hand, for the Mets, you look at Luis Angel Acuna, and he came up and he provided a great spark plug for the Mets when Francisco Lindor was hurt at the end of last season, but he has struggled mightily this spring. In that particular case, I'm not going to panic about Pete Alonso, but I am going to say that based on what we're seeing with Acuna, there's zero reason why he should break camp with the Mets, and it has everything to do with where they are at this point in their career. Now, on the other hand, you also have Brett Baty. Now, Brett Baty is having an amazing spring. Is that going to translate to him doing amazing once the season starts? Absolutely not. But think about it if it were the other way around, right? If Luis Angel Acuna was having an amazing spring and Brett Baty was batting 120, you'd have tons of Mets fans saying, see, Baty's a bum, it doesn't matter. And again, that's not the measured approach. It's not the way to handle these things. Brett Baty is showing what he can do while under pressure because he knew he was under pressure to make the team. And that's one of the interesting things that goes with this is there pressure on them in spring training? And the answer for some players is yes, there is pressure, and for other players, there's no. So there was zero pressure on Brandon Sproat this spring training because there was basically a 0% chance he was going to make the roster out of spring. So you will kind of get to see him pitch in a kind of a more relaxed way. But Brett Baty has a ton of pressure because he knew if he did not hit like crazy this spring, there was little to no chance that he was going to break camp with the roster. So I actually put a little more stock in Baty's performance than I would in Vientos' performance because Vientos basically has a spot locked up. Now, I'm excited for him. I hope that he keeps hitting like that. But the Vientos spot at third base was pretty much locked up at the end of last season. And so I just want to kind of help you, and you can transfer this, even if you're not a Mets fan, you can transfer this to whatever other teams you watch, and you just have to look at them. Now, obviously, if you see something that's not being fixed or corrected, that's something of concern. So I'll point out something that I saw last night with the Mets with Francisco Alvarez. He struggles with swinging at that low outside pitch. And what was he still doing consistently in spring? He's still swinging at that low outside pitch that he can't reach and is striking out because of it. And so what you want to be looking at overall is kind of look at it from a coach's perspective. And I think if we would start to do this, we'd start to look at our teams more from a coach's perspective as opposed to looking at it purely from a stats perspective, a win-loss perspective, or a fan perspective, especially early in the season. You would maybe see the game in a different way. And I think it's kind of maybe more the way that our fathers and our grandfathers watched the game. They just look to see, wow, you know what? He's swinging the bat well. It's just the ball's not falling in. Whereas nowadays it's like, well, he went 0 for 3. He's a bum. Yeah, I mean, it could be 0 for 3, but was it 0 for 3 because he struck out looking helpless at the plate, or was he 0 for 3 and he just smoked the ball 3 times and it just happened to be hit directly to where they played him? I mean, it's a huge difference in those things. And so just kind of looking through the full spectrum of things, I'm not really too worried about people like Francisco Lindor. We know he's a notorious slow starter. And obviously he would like to not be a slow starter, but that's just kind of how he is, because it takes him a while to get all of his mechanics worked out. I'm not worried about Juan Soto, but I would have a little bit of concern about seeing Francisco Alvarez not making the corrections that he needs to make at the plate. I'd have some concerns about Luis Angel Acuna really ready to be up full time. And so I think for that reason, you're going to see Acuna go to the minors. And I think it should be very noted that when Brett Baty came into the game yesterday, he came in as a second baseman. Why? Because that gives them the flexibility. If especially Nimmo is injured, you can move Jeff McNeil to the outfield if you feel comfortable having Baty play second base and Vientos play third. You see, so there's this position flexibility, and that is actually a huge benefit to the team. And we were talking about it last night on the stream, that there's rumors that Baty's been learning some outfield as well. And so if you start to have Brett Baty now can play third, and so he can play third if Vientos is DHing, or if he's out of the lineup for the day, he can play second if McNeil is DHing or out of the lineup, or if McNeil is playing in the outfield, or eventually Brett Baty could even play in the outfield. That position versatility is going to be something that makes him more valuable. And if his bat isn't A+ level, but maybe it's say B or B- level, but he has position versatility, then that raises his overall player profile to something that's a whole lot better than this. And also you want to just look at those things. So that's what I would caution you. So does spring training matter? The simple answer is yes and no. It depends on the player. It depends on the position battle. It depends on if there's pressure on them. And I know there's a lot of people who want Baty gone. And I will just continue to reiterate, even if you don't think Brett Baty is part of the Mets' future, you want him to do well. This idea that you would root against Brett Baty, you want him to do well, because even if he's not part of the Mets' long-term plans, that increases his trade value. And maybe the only reason you want him gone is because he hasn't produced at the major league level. But if he starts producing at the major league level, you'll say, hey, we'd like to have him here. And so that's the other thing that as fandom I would just remind you is, like, look, it's not about what they have done per se. Unless they win you a championship, then that maybe always matters. It's more about what are they able to do going forward. And I look at this is spring training, this is baseball, it's a fresh start. Hope springs eternal, right? Every team, no team has ruined their season yet. I mean, I know, don't worry, White Sox, we'll get there soon. But like, there are lots of things, and we should be rooting for progression for these players. We should be cheering them on and not getting all over them and getting frustrated with them because you're not seeing something that you like. And again, I don't see the narrative. If the narrative is, well, we can't trust Brett Baty because he hasn't done it in the regular season, like, that may be true, but that's also the past. And let's see what he brings this year. I think this is the make or break year for Brett Baty with the Mets. I think he's either going to catch on, but I honestly do believe that there are multiple teams that would be able to fit Brett Baty in their starting lineup given the opportunity to do so if they weren't looking for the same thing. And I would remind you too that this Mets lineup is looking for different things now than what it was, right? Remember, when Francisco Alvarez was called up, he was called up with this huge pressure to have to, hit home runs and do a whole bunch of stuff. And, I think when Brett Baty gets called up, all these guys were called up kind of under pressure. Now, all of a sudden, we've got a fresh start with this season where the Mets are not under pressure. Why? Because Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor take the bulk of the pressure that's going to be put on this team. If this team struggles out of the gate, it's going to be all eyes on Juan Soto, all eyes on Francisco Lindor. In fact, I think it even takes the pressure off of Pete Alonso, because Pete is almost, how he joined the team almost became an afterthought. And it's like, well, the Mets obviously were content going into the season without Pete if a deal didn't work out. So that means they were content putting all the pressure on Lindor and Soto. And so I think having that and having those two be the magnet for all the pressure, for all the focus of any struggles that the team has as a whole, is going to tremendously free up the rest of the roster to do what they just have to do. And it's no longer do they have to go out and be the ones that make the magic happen. They just have to keep the lineup moving, have good at-bats, put the ball in play. And I think when you have that attitude and you're no longer worried about, I have to go up there and I have to get a hit and I have to hit a home run, that leads to overswinging and bad mechanics. Instead, it's like, I need to get up there and I just got to try to find a way to get on base. And then all of a sudden that takes the pressure off. And you've started to see, again, I know some of you guys want McNeil gone, but you've started to see McNeil putting together better at bats this spring. Why? Well, maybe he's not listening to the analytics geeks quite as much, and maybe the pressure is off of him having to feel like, oh, I was a batting champion, I have to be a batting champion again, and all these different things. That if there's that mindset shift, we can do that. And so that's what I would look for as we go forward. That's why I think Brett Baty, it's why I've been saying for weeks, Brett Baty is going to break camp and come to the Major League roster with the Mets. I still believe it. I still like him. I think there's enough playing time there, especially with Nimmo. We're gonna bring him back slowly with the injuries because they want to make sure they have him for the stretch run. I think there is plenty of time for Vientos and Nimmo to both be on this team, and for Vientos to get some days at third, some days at DH, for Baty to get some days at third, some days at second. And again, if it's really true that there's outfield, then that can be there. Of course, Vientos can play first occasionally too. And so I think that going into this, that's how I would be judging the spring as what it is. In the same way, I'm not going to panic about Edwin Diaz in that performance. Obviously, it was an atrocious performance. It was also his first live pitching. And he's pitching against guys who have been playing live for now 2, almost 3 weeks, right? And he's going in there kind of like, it's different. It's just different. And we don't know what sort of pitches he's trying, what sort of mindset he's trying, what sort of different mechanics he's trying. Unless you're studying these things deeply, you're not going to catch all of those things. And so you just kind of go from there. And then you got to remember, the Mets are built out with multiple guys who can close. So if there is a slump for Edwin Diaz, or if he gets off to a slow start, you have other guys who can be closers. And I'm just not going to be in panic mode over things I see in spring training, because ultimately the goal is to get ready for the regular season. And I'd rather see them working on these things now and getting all of those hitches in their mechanics figured out and fixed, as opposed to doing that. So let me know, are you concerned about any players on the Mets? Comment down in the comments below, and we will talk to you again soon. Let's go Mets.